Have you ever stopped to think that time might be more than just a tool we use to measure days and hours? What if I told you there's a clock capable of stopping minutes before an inexplicable tragedy occurs? Sounds like something out of a movie, right? But what if I told you it's real, and that it has more power than you imagine? If you're curious to understand what's behind this mystery, subscribe to the channel, like it, and turn on notifications, because what you're about to hear will change your perception of time, and perhaps even your own destiny. I'm Catherine, an investigator of unexplained events, and what I'm going to share with you today is a story that will make you question everything you know about time. With every minute, you'll delve deeper into a plot that blends mystery, intersecting destinies, and a clock capable of predicting tragedies. But does it have the power to change everything, or are we simply following a predetermined path? Stay with us and find out, because every second brings a new revelation. I clearly remembered the day I first encountered the story about this pocket watch. Almost like an urban legend. It wasn't just a collector's item or a simple accessory. This watch, with its worn metal case and hands that seemed to age faster than any other, had a dark and unusual history. Its origins, well, no one knew for sure, but rumors pointed to a 19th century watchmaker who, according to some, had made the watch for a specific purpose, to preserve time or perhaps manipulate it. At the time, I was investigating a series of unexplained events, and the watch turned up in the middle of an investigation into a string of mysterious deaths in a small town. Apparently, each of the victims had something in common. They had all come into contact with the watch. Some locals said the watchmaker, a reclusive and eccentric man, had an obsessive interest in predicting death, believing that time could be manipulated to prevent tragedies. But like most stories involving the unexplained, this explanation seemed too good to be true. Initial discoveries about the clock revealed that it was not just a precision mechanism, but rather an artifact imbued with a peculiar aura. What intrigued me even more was how it always stopped minutes before a cataclysmic event. Imagine the scene. The clock striking 11:56, and immediately, tragedy unfolding. What the hell was going on there? I needed answers, and as I followed the story's trail, I realized that the secret lay not in the clock, but in the man who created it. I investigated the details, sifting through every clue, and soon stumbled upon an intriguing theory. The watchmaker had, in fact, lost a loved one in a horrific accident, and his quest to control time was perhaps a desperate attempt to never lose anyone again. But what he didn't know, or perhaps he did, and yet couldn't help himself, was that tampering with time would always come at a price. And the watch, well, it was just beginning to show just how high that price would be. And now, I knew there was something even darker behind that clock. Something that connected the past to the present in a way no human being should ever attempt to fathom. But like any good mystery, each answer only brought more questions. And the most disturbing was yet to come. I was beginning to realize that the clock's story wasn't just a simple curiosity or an antique object with a history. No, it was something much deeper and more disturbing. There was a connection between it and unexplained events that transcended any rational explanation. As an investigator, my mission was to understand the how and the why, but I soon realized that in trying to discover the clock's origin, I was also getting lost in its web of mystery. One of the first things that struck me was when a clock, then stored in a safe deposit box at a bank, stopped. This happened minutes before a devastating fire broke out, consuming the building and all the documents inside. I was there at the scene, witnessing the clock, which still kept time accurately until that exact moment. The question was, what made that object stop working before a tragedy? It was as if it were trying to warn. What intrigued me even more was the fact that, in the moments before the incident, the clock seemed to be working perfectly until it abruptly stopped. Of course, I knew people had a natural tendency to overvalue objects when they linked them to extraordinary events. But the clock didn't stop just once. It had this pattern. I began to wonder, was time itself being manipulated? Or perhaps it was fate, making us believe the clock had something to do with it, when in fact it was just a spectator. These questions began to dominate my mind and push me away from all the conventional explanations I had encountered so far. I found myself at a crossroads. unsure whether I was truly investigating a possibly supernatural object or being drawn into a story so strange it seemed true. An instinct told me to keep going, that I was about to discover something crucial. However, this instinct was accompanied by a feeling that, as I delved deeper into the mystery, I was getting closer to something dangerous, something that, if revealed, could change everything. And it was on this journey of mystery that something larger and stranger began to emerge, something that seemed beyond our understanding of time. But what exactly was this phenomenon? I was about to find out, and the clock, as always, was guiding me, or perhaps leading me to something even more disturbing. The first time I saw the clock stop in the face of something inexplicable was in a small village, far from civilization. The event occurred on a rainy night, and the place looked more like a scene from a horror movie than the location of a routine investigation. I was there to investigate the disappearance of a young woman who, according to rumors, had last been seen near an old mansion no one dared approach. The clock was with me, in my bag, a mere curiosity until that moment. But then, the impossible happened. I was inside the mansion, searching the rooms for clues, when the clock, without warning, stopped. The silence that followed was profound, something you only feel in places where fear seems to have taken shape. Minutes later, an explosion shook the house, and I could hear screams echoing through the night. The young woman had been found, but inexplicably, she was in such a profound state of shock that she could barely communicate. I knew, without a doubt, that the clock had done this, but what was happening? Most intriguing of all was what happened next. I asked the villagers if the clock had done this before, but no one seemed to know of anything similar. However, an old man who lived isolated in the mountains told me a story that made my hair stand on end. He said the clock had appeared in the village long before it was made, as a mysterious gift. Since then, whenever it stopped, something bad would happen, and time seemed to behave strangely, as if manipulated, stretched, or compressed at specific moments. To him, the clock was acting as a signal, something beyond human control. I didn't know what to think, but one thing was certain. The clock had stopped before the explosion, before the screams and chaos. It wasn't just a coincidence. It was as if the clock was foretelling tragedy, or perhaps controlling the fate of whoever touched it. Questions swirled in my mind. If the clock was indeed altering time, what else could it do? And most importantly, what would happen when it stopped again? But I couldn't afford to dwell on all this without taking action. I was about to discover the next piece of this puzzle, and the clock, as always, held the key. The story of the pocket watch would never be complete without mentioning its original owner, the eccentric watchmaker, who, according to legend, created it. As I began to investigate him further, I soon realized the truth lay far beyond a simple obsession with precision. His name was Elias Werner, and he was a man whose life was marked by tragedy and obsession. Contrary to what many might imagine, he was no ordinary watchmaker. He was a man tormented by loss, by a death that robbed him of something more precious than time, his ability to live with grief. Werner immersed himself in the study of time and its possible manipulations. It wasn't just about understanding the physics of clocks, but about freeing himself from a fate that had deeply marked him. His wife, Isabella, had died in a terrible accident when he was still young. She was with him the night the clock was created. But at the exact moment she died, something curious happened. The clock, which he had made, stopped for the first time. For Werner, this wasn't a coincidence. It was a sign, and from that moment on, he dedicated himself tirelessly to doing something unthinkable, manipulating time to reverse that moment. But what seemed like a quest for salvation actually led him down a darker path. Werner became obsessed with bringing Isabella back. He believed that if he could control the clock permanently, he might have a chance of finding a way to reverse her death. But, as he soon discovered, attempting to tamper with the flow of time was not without consequences. He began to notice that the more he manipulated the clock, the more events around him became distorted, as if the timeline were constantly being bent, twisted, and often broken. By that point, Werner had lost all sanity. He believed the watch somehow held the key to recovering what he loved most. But the watch wasn't just a tool. It had become an extension of Werner himself. as if the two shared an inexplicable perverse bond. Now, as an investigator, I knew his story had more to reveal, and perhaps Werner himself was more alive than I imagined. Somehow, inside that small metal box that accompanied me. While researching the watch's origins, I came across a series of historical accounts that seemed to nearly coincide with what I was witnessing. This wasn't the first time an object, a simple pocket watch, had appeared at the center of unexplained events and tragedies. What was most interesting, however, was the pattern. Reports of people finding relics similar to the watch emerged over several decades, at times of crisis or drastic change. It was as if the watch was somehow present at key points in history, always before a catastrophic event. In one of the oldest accounts I found, dated 1883, the clock appeared in a small village in France. The story told of a devastating fire that destroyed most of the town. The woman who owned the clock was the only survivor and swore that the clock stopped just before the flames spread. Curiously, for many years, the village remained unaware of the true cause of the fire, but the woman, now elderly, insisted that the clock had been the only warning. The clock stopped, and she left the house, saving her from the tragedy. What seemed like a coincidence soon came to be understood as a warning, an omen. But the most disturbing of all accounts, and the one that most made me question the clock's reality, occurred during World War II. British soldiers, while fighting on a battlefield in France, found a clock similar to the one I was investigating. Strangely, the clock stopped minutes before an explosion that devastated the entire unit. The soldier who found it, a man named Samuel Grayson, wrote in his diary that he felt a strange sense of déjà vu, as if he knew what was going to happen before it happened. He inexplicably left the scene moments before the explosion, while others who remained in the field were not so lucky. I was beginning to realize that the clock wasn't just a legend or an artifact with an interesting story. It had a prominent presence in history's most turbulent moments, as if it were a sort of observer, or worse yet, an agent of fate. What frightened me most wasn't the possibility that the clock possessed some kind of supernatural power, but rather the fact that it seemed to be ever present in moments of chaos, as if directly involved in disrupting the normal course of events. And with these historical accounts, something else was revealed to me. The clock was connected to a pattern that repeated itself through the centuries. But as I would soon realize, that wasn't even half the mystery. What was about to unfold in my own investigation would bring more answers, but it would also put me on an even more dangerous path than I imagined. When the clock first stopped in the face of tragedy, it was as if something insane had been unleashed. It wasn't just the deaths that terrified me, but the circumstances in which they occurred. Each victim was connected to the clock in some way. The first was a journalist named Richard Cole, an incredibly skeptical man who, unlike many, didn't believe in superstitions or unexplained phenomena. He received the clock as a gift from an anonymous collector, and from the moment he touched it, his life began a path of mysterious deaths and events beyond his control. Cole's story is one of the most impactful in my investigation. He used the clock in one of his most important articles, where he reported on cases of unexplained disappearances in the countryside of a small town. He thought the clock would be a good symbol for his story, a touch of mystery to attract readers' attention. But as he delved deeper into the investigation, strange things began to happen. The clock stopped before each new victim, and Cole noticed that it always seemed to tell the exact time, but with a delay of minutes. It was as if time was distorted as he progressed, a phenomenon he tried to ignore, but which consumed him until the very end. At the end of his investigation, Richard Cole was in a similar position to others who had come into contact with the watch. He was close to discovering something terrible, something he wasn't supposed to understand. When he was found dead, the entire town was in shock. The watch stopped once again, minutes before his death, just like the previous victims. Most intriguing was the fact that, after his death, the watch disappeared, and no one saw it again, for years, until it came into my possession. Cole's case wasn't unique, and with each new victim, the pattern became clearer. Each person who touched the watch, who connected with it in some way, was doomed to a mysterious death or misfortune. I knew the watch was somehow linked to these fatalities, but why did it seem to choose its victims? And what did these people have in common? I was about to find out, but before I could reach that answer, another, even more disturbing event occurred. As I began investigating the clock and its effects, a theory began to emerge in my mind, a theory that, while seemingly absurd at first glance, gained traction as more details unfolded. What if the clock wasn't just an object with a supernatural connection, but rather a manifestation of fate, something that inexplicably forced people to follow a predetermined path with no way to escape it? This idea deeply disturbed me, but at the same time, it seemed to fit with the events I was witnessing. The first clue that the clock might be a tool of fate came from an old diary found at the site where Richard Cole was found dead. In it, he mentioned something peculiar about how the clock seemed to predict what would happen, but in a much more complex way. He described a sense of inevitability, as if it were impossible to escape the events the clock seemed to foretell. Cole, who had always believed in free will, was disturbed to realize that the choices he made were somehow being shaped by a higher power, a power he could not comprehend. That night, pondering the theory of fate, I began to wonder, was the clock not only predicting tragedies, but also creating them? Perhaps it wasn't simply an object of evil, but rather a tool used by something greater, a force that cared nothing for individual lives, but was driving history toward an inevitable end. And worse, what would this mean for me? As an investigator, it was impossible to ignore the idea that somehow I might just be following a path already laid out by that clock, like all the other victims before me. The theory that the watch was a manifestation of fate grew even stronger when, during further investigation, I came across a similar case. A young woman named Emily, who owned the watch, was experiencing a series of strange coincidences, all pointing to a tragic and imminent future. She came to me, in despair, believing the watch was the cause of all her misfortunes. She wasn't wrong, but what she didn't know was that somehow the watch was connecting her actions and decisions to something beyond her own will. She was being pulled toward a destiny she couldn't avoid, and the watch was the key to understanding it. I didn't know if I was more skeptical or more frightened by this theory, but something inside me couldn't stop thinking about it. If the clock really had the power to control fate, what would that mean for all of us? Would we, too, be under the control of a destiny we didn't choose? Before I could delve any deeper into this philosophical dilemma, something would happen to confirm that I was closer to the truth than I'd imagined. And of course, the clock was once again at the center of it all. As the mystery surrounding the clock deepened, I began to realize that it affected not only the victims directly connected to it, but also the people around them. There was something deeply disturbing about the reactions of those who had any contact with the clock, and this only increased my discomfort. These people seemed consumed by a growing anxiety, as if they were approaching something inevitable, but without knowing exactly what. And curiously, many began to demonstrate a strange connection with time itself, as if aware of the distortion occurring. I remember a specific case involving Richard Cole's brother, Michael. Michael was a fairly rational man, perhaps even more so than Richard, and at first, he tried to dismiss any idea that the clock held any supernatural power. But soon after his brother's death, he began acting increasingly erratic. He withdrew from social life, became obsessed with time, and would spend hours staring at the clock, as if trying to understand what it was trying to tell him. There were times when he would simply look at the clock and then at the wall clock in the living room, comparing the minutes. It was then that he told me, in a moment of despair, that he felt like time was repeating itself, or rather, that he was trapped in a time loop, and the clock was the catalyst. This type of behavior wasn't unique. Other people who had contact with the clock reported similar sensations of time distortion. Some said they felt out of place, as if they were living in two different moments at once. Others began having strange dreams, where they experienced events from the past and the future, but always with the clock present in each of these moments. I didn't know if this was simply the psychological effect of being in contact with something so mysterious, or if there was truly something deeper at play, something that affected their perception of time and reality in a way that defied all logic. These reactions from people began to make me wonder, was the clock shaping reality around it, or was it the other way around? Were people beginning to believe the clock had power, or was the clock's power actually manifesting itself and affecting their minds and perceptions? It was difficult to distinguish truth from illusion, but one thing I knew for sure, the clock's impact went beyond the physical. It was messing with people's psyches, their perceptions, and the way they viewed time and space around them. I knew I was about to face something that not even I, a seasoned investigator, could fully comprehend. But what exactly was that something? And what else was the clock about to reveal? I had no doubt that I was dealing with something much larger and more complex than just an artifact lost in time. Although my intuition led me down increasingly mysterious paths, I knew I couldn't simply ignore scientific explanations. As a researcher, I had to consider all possibilities. That's when I began searching for experts who could offer a more rational perspective on what was happening. The initial reaction from the scientific community was skeptical, as I expected. Many of those I interviewed were physicists and engineers, and they all expressed disbelief at the idea that a clock could somehow manipulate time or have any effect beyond its mechanical function. However, a small group of scientists decided to investigate the clock further, considering less conventional theories. One of these scientists, Dr. Victor Hale, a theoretical physicist, suggested that the clock might have something to do with the time warp. He cited an old theory, developed by some physicists in the 1940s, that postulated the existence of temporal anomalies, events that could occur when time warped or distorted in unconventional ways. This theory, though dismissed by many, seemed to have some plausibility when applied to the clock. Hale suggested that, somehow, the clock could be at the center of such an anomaly, acting as a catalyst or perhaps an inductor of time warps. Hale's support. I decided to follow a series of experiments in which we placed the clock under controlled conditions. At first, nothing extraordinary happened. The clock seemed to behave like any other, except that it always stopped when it was about to be observed for more than a few minutes at a time. However, during one of these experiments, something incredible happened. When the clock was placed in a vacuum chamber, it stopped, but soon after the environment around it began to oscillate. The laboratory, which had previously been static, seemed to be distorted, as if being pulled into another dimension. Time somehow seemed to behave strangely, with seconds stretching and shrinking inexplicably. After this incident, Dr. Hale was visibly shaken. He no longer knew what to think. "This clock," he said, "is not just any object. It is connected to something our science cannot yet explain. Perhaps it holds the key to something much greater." These words stuck in my mind, and I knew we were on the verge of discovering something monumental. But what else could the clock reveal to us? And how far was I willing to go to understand that truth? As the clock became more of a part of my daily life, I began to realize that it was not just marked by strangeness, but by a growing sequence of unexplained events. I was investigating a case in Devon, England, where several people reported hearing strange noises and seeing fleeting shadows before a series of accidents. Interestingly, everyone involved was somehow connected to the clock. Whether by having touched it, owned it, or even heard of it, I couldn't ignore the coincidences. Something was clearly being triggered every time the clock was present. The first unexplained event occurred on a quiet night when a man named Joseph Barrett, who owned the watch, had a terrifying vision just before being hit by a speeding car. Before the accident, Barrett reported seeing a scene that seemed to be happening in the distant future, a vision of his own death. He tried to walk away from the scene, but was unable to. When I arrived at the scene, the watch had stopped again, at exactly the same minutes it had marked before the tragedy. The strangest thing is that, throughout the incident, time seemed distorted, as if the perception of those around him was being affected. Some witnesses said they felt time broken, as if something was wrong with the flow of reality. These events didn't stop there. More cases began to emerge, each more disturbing than the last. In a small village, a worker who had found the clock at the local market found himself trapped in a fire that destroyed his home. He was inside, trying to put out the flames when the clock stopped. By this time, the fire was spreading rapidly, but strangely, no one seemed to remember how or why the fire had started. There was no logical explanation, and the clock, which was in the house, seemed to be the key to the series of coincidences that led to the tragedy. During the investigation, I realized that the sensation of temporal distortion was a pattern. When the clock stopped, those involved experienced a blurred reality where actions made no sense and time became difficult to measure. I gradually realized that the clock not only predicted or signaled these events, but somehow seemed to connect them in a supernatural way, as if time and our perception of reality were being manipulated. As more people engaged with it, the feeling of broken reality intensified. I knew I was dealing with something far beyond a simple ancient artifact. Something far more disturbing was at play, something that, as an investigator, I could no longer ignore, and as always, The clock, in its silent existence, continued to lead me toward a mystery with no apparent solution. With all the unexplained events I had witnessed, I began to delve deeper into a theory that, while disconcerting, seemed the only plausible explanation. The clock was somehow connected to people's fates, not in a simple way, like a prediction of something to come, but in a more complex way, where the clock not only signaled what was to come, but also forced events to unfold in a specific way. It wasn't just a passive observer of time, it was somehow in control. Perhaps it was even an entity that governed the destinies of those who approached it, leading them down a path of tragedy or fate that was already set, as if destiny were being written in the invisible ink of time. I began to question whether time itself was an illusion, a construct the clock could bend or manipulate. There was something inexplicable about the way events unfolded immediately after the clock stopped, something that seemed tied to the idea that the clock not only reacted to events, but also induced them. The theory that the clock was a kind of guardian of fate, capable of rewriting the course of its owner's life, became increasingly convincing. And this wasn't just an object that altered the perception of time, the clock seemed to somehow direct the flow of events, as if orchestrating the tragedy. But with each answer the clock offered, even more questions arose. And most disturbing was the impact this knowledge would have on the future. If the clock controlled destiny, what did that mean for the choices people made? Were they truly free to decide their future? Or were they merely walking a predetermined path, like puppets in the hands of time? I no longer knew whether I was investigating an object, a person, or a cosmic force. The clock, increasingly, seemed to be the convergence point between free will and destiny, a fine line between freedom and fate. I found myself faced with an existential dilemma. Was I, as an investigator, merely witnessing these events, or was it possible that I, too, was somehow under the influence of the clock? The questions that arose were unsettling. Would I be the next victim, or perhaps the next one chosen by the clock to continue its mysterious plot? I was closer than ever to discovering the truth, but with each step, the risk increased. Was I finally reaching the point of no return, where my fate was already written and all I could do was accept what was to come? As my investigation progressed, I began to discover something that only reinforced the feeling that the clock was not just an ancient object with an unusual history, but an artifact with a much deeper purpose. In my research, I found mention of ancient prophecies that spoke of a clock that marks the timeline. These writings dated back centuries, and they all seemed to refer to the same object. What stunned me was the realization that these prophecies were clearly connected to what was happening to me and the people around me. The clock was not just an instrument, but a key to a destiny already mapped out, a prediction of catastrophes and inexplicable events that were about to unfold. One such prophecy, written by a 13th century monk, said that when the clock of death stops, the end is imminent. The prophecy spoke of a clock that had the ability to foretell destructive events, but also of being the beginning of a new era, one where control over time and human choices would be challenged. As I read these words, I began to realize that the clock was far more than a simple measuring device. It had a much greater purpose, and I was about to become another piece in this plot. But what was this end the prophecy spoke of? Were we all, unknowingly, following in the footsteps of a story that had been written long ago? This discovery was like a bomb exploding inside me. The clock's connections to historical events and tragedies now seemed more than coincidences. With each person who touched it, a new chapter of the prophecy unfolded, leading to tragedies and inexplicable events. The most frightening thing was that the clock was fulfilling a role that had apparently been predicted for centuries. And me? I was increasingly involved, as if I had been chosen to unravel a secret destined to be revealed. The idea that I was part of a prophecy didn't bring me relief, but rather a growing fear. Was the clock somehow guiding humanity toward a future no one could prevent? But the most intriguing thing of all was the nature of the prophecy itself. It spoke not only of destruction, but also of rebirth. The clock represented not just the end of something, but the beginning of a new era. This made me wonder, was the clock responsible for bringing humanity to this new stage? Or was I, in trying to understand what was happening, opening a door that could no longer be closed? As answers grew ever further away, the clock, with its silent agony, continued to dictate events as I neared the end of my investigation. When the watch first disappeared, I didn't know what to think. After months of investigation, of seeing and witnessing the watch's impact on people's lives, it simply vanished. There were no signs of theft or violence. The watch was there, and the next moment, it was gone. What seemed like a simple disappearance became a profound mystery. The feeling of helplessness was overwhelming, as if time itself were challenging me to continue my search. It was as if the watch had disappeared on purpose, leaving me with more questions than answers, as if it had been removed from my life to force me to face an even greater truth. I remember searching the spot where the clock had last been. Nothing. Not a trace. The only thing left was a feeling of emptiness, as if something essential had been removed from the space around it. And then, just as I was about to give up, the key to the mystery revealed itself. The clock hadn't disappeared, it was hiding. I began to notice a pattern. The clock would vanish just as it was about to reveal itself to something even more incomprehensible. It seemed to understand that with each discovery, the mystery was growing denser, more dangerous. It was during a sleepless night, as I began to connect all the dots of my investigation, that I had an insight. The watch was not just an object, but an entity, with an intention of its own. It didn't disappear by chance. It hid itself when it sensed the right moment hadn't yet arrived, and, as if it had challenged me to take a longer path, it was preparing to reveal something I wasn't ready to see. The watch's disappearance wasn't the end of my journey, but a new beginning, a sign that the truth was closer than ever. I knew the watch was now in someone's possession once again. Who would be next? And what else did the watch have in store for the future? It was clear it wouldn't just let itself be found again without further ado. It was biding its time to reveal its true nature, and I, once again, was on the verge of discovering something that would change everything. The watch, with its silent presence, was no longer just a mystery. It was now a constantly moving enigma, always ahead of me, always challenging me to keep up with its pace. As I delved deeper into the clock's case, an intriguing discovery began to form. Before me, the clock was not merely an isolated piece of mystery, but rather had a connection to great historical figures whose fates seemed to have been inexplicably intertwined with the artifact. What made me pause and reflect was the fact that figures as diverse as scientists, politicians, and even famous artists had somehow crossed paths with the clock. Each of them seemed to have something in common: a search for truth, a lust for power, or, in the case of some, a personal tragedy that linked them to the clock in a way that defied all logic. The first name that caught my attention was that of the famous physicist Nikola Tesla. During my research, I discovered that Tesla, in his later years, referred to a time reliquary, an object he believed could manipulate the timeline in ways conventional science couldn't explain. While his possession of the watch was never confirmed, the fact that he spoke of the possibility of controlling the flow of time left me with a sense of déjà vu. Most intriguingly, he began making these references shortly before his death, which occurred mysteriously and alone. Tesla, who had challenged the limits of science, seems to have been somehow touched by the watch, or at least by the idea that time could be manipulated in inexplicable ways.
Another name that surfaced in my research was that of the Roman Emperor Julius Caesar. According to a series of ancient documents I found in a military history archive, Caesar received a very peculiar gift from a mysterious traveler during his campaigns in Gaul: a pocket watch. Some scholars believe this watch was the same one, or a version of it, that would later become an object of obsession. What caught my attention was the fact that, before his death, Caesar began making notes about omens of the weather, mentioning in his private correspondence that time seemed to bend around him, as if the major decisions of his life were being dictated by forces beyond his control. And from then on, tragedy struck. He was assassinated in a conspiracy that, ironically, also had a profound impact on the history of Rome. Finally, something that frightened me even more was the connection with artists like Vincent van Gogh, who in his final days mentioned seeing the future and the past collide. He, like many others before him, seemed to have been touched by an invisible force, something that made him question time, fate, and reality itself. I was beginning to realize that the clock was not a mere artifact, but a catalyst for those on the brink of major changes or catastrophic events in their lives. These individuals, so distinguished, so powerful in their respective fields, had been driven to the brink of madness or disaster by something even they could not control. And what made me wonder even more was this:
What happened to all these great men and women when they came into contact with the clock? What did they discover that I hadn't yet grasped? I was on the verge of discovering the truth, but I knew it would come with even greater consequences. As the clock became more widely known, its effects began to reverberate, unsettlingly, not only in the lives of those directly affected, but also in society at large. When a tragedy linked to the clock occurred, what seemed like an isolated and mysterious event spread like a virus, leaving people in a state of unease and uncertainty. News of unexplained events became part of urban folklore, and the media, of course, wasted no time in fueling the myth. The clock's impact began to shape society's attitudes, which began to view life and time from a completely different perspective. The first changes occurred in small local communities, where people began to distrust anyone who owned the watch. There were rumors about it, of course, but soon people began to act differently. A climate of paranoia took hold of many, and anyone in possession of the watch was often looked at with suspicion, as if they were carrying a curse. I saw this firsthand in a small rural town, where a man who owned the watch was somewhat ostracized. No one wanted to approach him, fearing that somehow his proximity would bring chaos. But the most curious thing was how major cities like London and New York reacted. Scientists began studying the clock and its possible influence on people and events, but even with expert analysis, no one could understand what was happening. The media, eager for sensational stories, made the clock one of the biggest sensations of the moment. However, the incessant attention on it seemed to have the opposite effect on the public. Instead of attracting more curiosity, the clock began to alienate people, creating a kind of emotional distance, as if society were somehow scared by the idea that time could be manipulated and that their fates might be at stake. Over time, some people began to form secret groups, trying to find ways to unravel the clock and understand its power. The clock's influence expanded into a kind of time cult, with people gathering to discuss how they could use the clock to change their destinies. Society was dividing between those who feared the clock and those who believed that by understanding its true power, they could control their own future. It was the beginning of a new way of thinking, where the connection between time and destiny was stronger than ever. Yet with each new study and each new theory about the clock, what I realized was that society was ultimately becoming more aware of its own vulnerability. The clock wasn't just a historical relic or a scientific curiosity, it was a constant reminder that time, the seemingly immutable factor, was beyond anyone's control. And the more people tried to understand what it represented, the more they found themselves at the mercy of time itself, like puppets in a plot no one could predict. Despite the evidence that the clock was at the center of a series of unexplained events, there were always those who opposed the idea that it possessed some kind of supernatural power. Some scientists, like Dr. Howell, believed it was nothing more than coincidences or natural temporal glitches that were being misinterpreted. Others, with a more pragmatic view, were convinced that the clock was an elaborate hoax, a piece of deception designed to generate panic and distrust. For them, resistance to what the clock represented was a matter of logic and reason, but as I delved deeper into the investigation, I began to realize that something even more complicated was going on. There was a silent, deeper resistance that didn't originate solely from scientists or skeptics. There was a kind of emotional resistance, especially among the victims' families. Many of the people who had lost loved ones to the phenomena linked to the clock began to band together, refusing to believe that the clock had any real influence. They wanted to deny the idea that something as simple as a clock could have controlled their loved ones' fates. The pain of loss was so great that, rather than confront it, people clung to the idea that the clock had no power, that it was merely a product of a chaotic world where tragedies occurred without explanation. This kind of resistance, while natural, became a barrier to understanding what was really happening. The families opposed my investigation, fearing that by delving deeper, I would uncover something they weren't ready to face. This left me in a difficult situation. As an investigator, I was seeking the truth, but for many, that truth was unacceptable. They preferred to ignore the facts and live with the illusion that the tragedy had occurred by chance, without a greater cause. However, this resistance didn't stop the clock from continuing its journey. It seemed to hold an invisible power over people, causing even the most rational to doubt their own perceptions. As more people began searching for answers, many began to question their own view of reality. Did the clock truly possess some supernatural power, Or was it merely a reflection of human insecurities? Were we all in the end simply trying to deny the inevitability of a fate we couldn't control? The clock, in its silent resistance, was becoming a symbol of the struggle against destiny. And I, even knowing the path was fraught with obstacles, knew that the only way to understand the clock's true nature was to keep moving forward, resisting all attempts to hide the truth. But what was that truth, after all? I was closer than ever to finding out, and with each new resistance, the connection between the clock and the destiny of us all became clearer. When the watch disappeared for the second time, a chill ran down my spine. The feeling of déjà vu was unmistakable. Everything seemed to be repeating itself. The watch, which had been in my care for months, vanished without a trace, as if it had been swallowed by time again. Most disconcerting of all was the manner in which it disappeared. I was in my office, reviewing some notes and reports on the watch's victims, when upon looking at the desk where I had left it, I realized it was gone. There were no signs of forced entry, nor any clue that anyone had taken it. It was as if the watch had simply vanished into thin air. Investigations into the disappearance began immediately, but no one could understand what was happening. The first theory that emerged was that someone might have stolen the watch, an idea that was quickly dismissed. It didn't make sense. Who could want such a dangerous object? Furthermore, what disturbed me most was the feeling that the watch wasn't getting lost, but removing itself from our reality voluntarily, as if somehow it was deciding where and when it would appear, and would only be accessible when the right moment arrived. This idea terrified me even more, because it implied that somehow the watch was in control. With the clock's disappearance, I began to investigate the implications of this phenomenon. What did it mean that it vanished whenever I was close to discovering the truth? Was the clock trying to keep me from something I wasn't supposed to understand? I knew I was dealing with something beyond my comprehension. And most disturbingly, as I investigated, I began to notice a pattern. Every time the clock disappeared, a new, inexplicable event occurred. The feeling of being in a game, where the clock was the master and I was merely a player, grew stronger with each passing second. However, this second time was different. I sensed something bigger was about to happen. Something beyond a simple investigation, or even a search for the truth. I was being guided to something even deeper. The watch's disappearance wasn't an end, but a beginning. It was hiding, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself again. And as always, the watch continued to dictate the rules of the game, while I desperately tried to understand its intentions. What would be the next step in this story that already stretched beyond the limits of reality? I didn't know, but one thing was certain: the watch was about to change everything. As the months passed, and more tragedies piled up, a new question began to arise in my mind. What would be the future of the clock? I knew it wouldn't be just another piece of mystery to be unraveled and forgotten. What was happening seemed to be part of something larger, a narrative still unfolding, and I was somehow being guided by it. The clock, with its ability to manipulate time and destinies, was no ordinary artifact. It had a purpose yet to be revealed, and I feared what that meant for the future of humanity. During my investigation, I found a series of records of other people who, like me, had been touched by the clock and its strange occurrences. Many of these people had disappeared, and accounts of them were sketchy, but what was clear was that no one who came into contact with the clock was immune to its effects. With each disappearance, the sense that the clock was preparing for something even greater became more real. I began to wonder if I was about to be part of a new phase of this story, or if I myself would be the next victim of its influence. What was clear was that the clock was no mere artifact of the past. It was a key to a future, yet to be written. As I delved deeper, a theory began to gain traction in my mind. What if the clock was the catalyst for something greater than simple time manipulation? What if I was dealing with a device designed to alter the course of history, something that not only observed, but also shaped the future to its will? This theory, though frightening, seemed the only plausible explanation for everything that had happened up to that point. And the scariest thing was that with each new piece of information, the clock seemed to move further out of my reach, as if preparing for a great revelation, or perhaps a great destruction. What made me even more apprehensive was the feeling that the clock was leading me to an inevitable end. Not in the sense of physical death, but in the sense that, by understanding its true nature, I was about to be transformed in ways I could not foresee. With each new discovery, I began to realize that the clock's future lay not only in its hands, but in the hands of everyone connected to it in some way. And the question that haunted me was, what would become of humanity when the clock finally revealed its true purpose? Would we be ready for what was to come? Or would it be too late to save what remained of our future? As more revelations about the watch emerged, a truth that had previously seemed distant began to crystallize in my mind. The watch was not just an object, but an artifact of power, not just any power, but something capable of manipulating timelines, influencing historical events, and perhaps even rewriting the future. What appeared to be a simple, old, featureless pocket watch was, in fact, a control mechanism, a key to a mastery over time that defied all human logic. The way it acted, manipulating decisive moments in people's lives, was not just a coincidence. It was a pattern, a design, something meticulously engineered to alter the course of history. The most disturbing thing was realizing that the clock's power wasn't limited to time as we know it. It seemed to have a hold on perception, as if those who came into contact with it were somehow altered. They were affected not only by the tragedies that occurred, but also by the choices they made, the paths they took. The clock seemed to be a master of decisions, orchestrating people's actions, guiding them, forcing them to follow a determined path. Like pieces in a game they couldn't control. And what disturbed me most was that, by touching the clock, people were not only predestined to suffer, but also to make choices that led them even deeper into the abyss of their own destiny. The investigations became increasingly complex. It was no longer a simple object of study, but the discovery of a much greater force, one that seemed to act in secret, altering historical events almost imperceptibly, but with devastating consequences. What had previously seemed like a coincidence now presented itself as an undeniable pattern. Each time the clock stopped, something big was happening, and that something was intrinsically linked to the power to manipulate time, to govern people's destinies in ways no one could foresee. The clock, as an artifact of power, was beyond any logical explanation. As this new perspective settled in my mind, a sense of urgency began to grow within me. I was no longer simply investigating a phenomenon, but something that had the potential to change the very nature of humanity. If the clock truly held the power to rewrite time and destinies, what did it mean for those who possessed it? Would they be able to control this power, or were they, in fact, puppets of this artifact, condemned to follow a destiny they could not escape? These were the questions that haunted me now, and the clock, with its silent presence, seemed closer than ever to revealing its intentions. As discoveries about the clock intensified, a crucial question began to haunt my mind. What would happen when the clock stopped permanently? All events up to that point were tied to this strange routine, where the clock always stopped minutes before something inexplicable happened. It acted as a catalyst for tragedy and chaos. But what would happen if it finally stopped once and for all? Would this be the end of its power, or perhaps would it mark the beginning of something even more terrifying? The first time the idea of an end struck me was one night when the clock was in my office. I was, once again, trying to understand its complexities and the impact it had on so many people's lives. Then, suddenly, the clock stopped. Without warning, without any sign of anomaly. It wasn't like all the other times. This time, it didn't start again. The silence that followed was profound and disconcerting. For the first time, nothing was happening. Time, it seemed, wasn't being manipulated. The clock, that powerful object, was standing still, and it was at that precise moment that I realized this end wasn't a relief. On the contrary, it signified something much greater, something beyond anyone's comprehension. What troubled me was what this meant for the future. The clock had always been the turning point, the signal that something extraordinary was about to happen, but now, without it, the feeling that the world was heading somewhere unknown became more real with each passing day. The people who had been touched by the clock began to live their lives with a strange emptiness, as if they were waiting for something that could no longer be achieved. The clock had somehow marked time, and now that it was stopped, what would come next? Were we all trapped in a future that had already been shaped? Or did the end of the clock mean the chance to rewrite our own stories? I knew the answer to these questions was closer than I imagined, but at the same time, there was something unsettling about this void. Something much greater was preparing to reveal itself. and the stopped clock seemed to be just a sign that the true test was yet to come. Would we, those touched by the clock, be able to find the balance between destiny and free will? Or had the clock finally pushed us to the limit of what humanity could comprehend? I was closer to the truth than ever before, and what awaited me beyond that point, only time or the lack thereof could tell. Now that you know the story behind the mysterious clock and its intriguing twists, I want to leave you with a question. Do you believe time can be manipulated? And further, are we all following a destiny we can't control? The clock wasn't just an artifact, it was a key that opened doors to truths that challenge our understanding of what is real and what is possible. And you, what would you do if you had the power to change your destiny? Leave your answers in the comments below and tell me, would you dare to face the mystery behind the clock? Or would you prefer to leave it where it is, in silence? If you enjoyed this story and want to continue exploring the mysteries that time and destiny have in store for us, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and stay tuned for future episodes. The mystery is far from over, and who knows, the clock may still have something to teach us.